Wind can damage trees in a variety of ways. Here, we present the top 5 types of damage caused by high wind events and how each type of damage impacts tree physiology and the potential for recovery. In other words, answering the all too common question, is this tree gonna make it?
I've never seen anything like this. It's incredible. It's completely devastating. I mean, from a science perspective and a forestry perspective, it's fascinating, but it's just the devastation it's 100% almost. This is a major limb that broke off, and there's a lot of different ways that trees can be damaged in these storms. And the way they're damaged, the position on the tree, and the position of the tree after they're damaged really determines your next steps about management. Should I salvage this log? Does it have any value? Do I just sit back and watch it recover? Is it gonna recover? So that's a kind of a neat thing to go around and just see and assess the damage, like where was it damaged, the extent of damage, and the actual process of damage when you're walking through your woodlands. Again, using extreme caution. These are very dangerous situations. So this is a real neat one. This is a branch that, a large main limb that ripped off, but you can see this is what I would call a trunk split or a splitting of the wood. And a lot of times you'll see this, it's still upright, but when you see extensive splitting like this in the main trunk, that is a very serious situation, and that tree is probably not going to survive, or it's going to at least be a hazard for the immediate future. But you can see this nice, real nice split here, and this almost shredding of this bark, like the wind was just twisting it, like you're taking a piece of rope and trying to unravel it backwards. So this is a really interesting way and a pretty severe form of damage that can happen to trees. So this one right here, this tree has been bent over to the left here, but as you can see at the break point there, there was not an actual snapping off of the tree, but again, it's a cool example of that perhaps the crown was twisting and then twisting the actual trunk of the tree, and that bark right there is just completely shredded. So sometimes you'll see that a lot. The tree will still be upright, but again, that damage to the trunk is very significant. This is a neat example of a way that a tree can be damaged and the degree of damage. So this tree has had almost all of its canopy damaged and removed. So as far as monitoring this tree and seeing it, if it's going to rebound or not, this is almost a definite that this tree is going to be in decline and on its way to being completely out of the picture here. So this tree will die. But you can see up there the canopy has been almost completely removed, but the trunk is completely intact. So again, this might be a potential for a salvage harvest, or if it meets your management objectives and it's not a risk, you can leave it for the variety of wildlife benefits it provides. So this one is a definite goner. This is a really interesting way that trees can kind of be damaged by a storm, and you see this more often than you would think in the woods. So this little hackberry here has been bent over by these other trees falling on it, and you don't really see any cracks or visual damage to the trunk here, and this tree is still very much alive. But what will happen now with this excessive weight on it is that one of these lateral branches often takes dominance when you get this the actual top put down, and over time this may form a pretty significant shoot and up to the sunlight. And if you look through the woods, if you walk through the woods, a lot of times you see an older tree that has a big S shape on it. It's a good chance that something like this had happened and one of these smaller shoots had taken over dominance and become the main leader. And one thing about these, if you're coming in here and cleaning up these situations, again, you know, logging is an incredibly dangerous occupation. It becomes even more dangerous when you've got twisted and trees laying on each other and things like this. But this tree right here is under an incredible amount of tension. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're sawing these up, and if you're trying to do this yourself. It's a very dangerous situation with the amount of tension that's on this wood right here. I don't know about this specific situation, but a lot of times you see it in urban areas and bottomland areas where the root system just doesn't have a chance to expand. So it's a very small, restricted root system. So say the soil is compacted, or it's surrounded by concrete, or the water table's super high. You know, the roots are not going to get out where they should be to have the proper anchorage in the soil. So when a high wind comes along and you've got all this weight and drag on the top, there's not much of a root system here to support it, and it's just what I call this a wind throw or a root ball failure that comes out. So this tree was basically uprooted. There was no real damage to the trunk, but the roots failed and the wind basically pushed the entire rooting mass up out of the ground and exposed it. So again, if you're talking about is this tree going to go and survive, this is probably a no on this one. So, but again, if you're in here cutting these up, one thing to remember is that if you take the weight off this top, there's a very good chance this root ball could spring back up and impact you. So again, when you're out here doing this work, it's incredibly important to be cognizant of all the things that could happen once you make that cut. After these storms, you're going to get an incredible amount of debris on the ground here, which is fine. It's part of the natural process. It's great for the soil. Eventually, it's great for, you know, wildlife and insects and all that stuff. This also has potential to be drug out and salvaged as part of like recouping some costs of the recovery. You can do a salvage harvest and get some money for these downed trees that are intact and valuable. But one thing to remember is that a lot of this debris, if just left here, it's going to prevent access to your forest in the future. It's going to prevent management that might be needed in the future, because now we've got all this sunlight. We're going to see a resurgence in the understory, which could include invasive species. And with this debris still in here and that resurgence of the understory, it's going to be very difficult to access this site and do any kind of management that you might need to meet your objectives moving forward beyond the storm. This is kind of one of the more dramatic ways that you can see trees fail during these storms, and the trunk here itself on this red oak has just completely snapped. The canopy is snapped off and it's now laying on the ground here. So this is definitely a tree that will not make it, even though we're seeing a flush of new regrowth. So those are called Epicormic Shoots, that new kind of clumpy foliage patches there on the trunk. Those emerged after the storm. So that's only about 2 months of growth right there. But those are not in any way going to replace a solid, well-formed canopy that's going to be structurally sound. Those are kind of a tree's response to the shock. So it's a kind of a last-ditch effort to keep alive and keep making photosynthate to keep going. But yeah, tree snapped in half. That's a good one that's probably going to not make it. So this is a really neat example on this basswood here of Epicormic Shoots. So a lot of times after storms, you see a lot of these emerging. And again, we're about 2 months out after the storm, and you can see this fresh flush of growth in that short time period. A lot of times when the tree is stressed or it loses its canopy or it's heavily damaged from above, you'll see these popping out. These are emerging from hidden buds in the bark, which become active after stress, or in this case, what might have happened is we're now exposing this trunk to a ton of new sunlight. And with that, these Epicormic shoots are now emerging. So you're going to see this a lot after storms come through and heavy damage to trees. One thing to remember though, these are not going to really rebuild that canopy in a structurally sound manner. So if you look up and you see a lot of large limbs missing and a lot of canopy damage, but you see this reflush of growth, this isn't going to establish the canopy to it where it once was. These are going to be weak unions, and it's just not going to be the same as it once was structurally and for the overall health of the tree. This is kind of a last-ditch effort to keep that photosynthate production going. So if you were, this is kind of in logging what they would call, or what looks like called a barber chair. So what you would be doing if you were trying to fell this tree and you made your back cut and it split like this and the butt popped up, that's an incredibly dangerous situation.
So you get halfway through the tree on your back cut and it just gives out.
Yep, yeah. And a lot of times, like you'll see, it's got this rot at the base. So again, that's one of the ways that this tree was kind of predisposed to this storm damage. And again, it was 130-mile-an-hour winds. But.
So this tree has a lot of decay here in the bottom, and you can see that's kind of ultimately what caused it to break the way that it did. But what we want to point out here is that wood decay can come in through any injury to the tree. It's tough to say what came first here, the insects, or maybe the root system got injured by something else and then the decay moved in, but ultimately that's what caused this tree to fall down. Some of the things that can, cause a fungal infection are any type of injury. So that can be logging activities, it can be cattle grazing, it can be other trees falling in the woods. So there's a lot of things that can cause injury that could lead to a fungal decay infection.
And again, this goes back to assessing what kind of damage you've sustained here, and that's going to drive a lot of things like, do we harvest this tree? When do we harvest it? Do we leave it for wildlife? All that kind of thing. Is this tree going to rebound? Should we just monitor it and kind of watch it and see if it bounces back?
But yeah, you've got like this trees where the trunks are completely snapped. You've got trees where the canopy has just been completely removed. You've got trees where there's splits down in the middle of the trunk. You've got trees where there's root failure and the root ball has been exposed. And you've got trees that have actually been bent in half, like a piece of rebar, that are still alive but significantly compromised. So there's a lot of ways that these trees can be damaged, and that's going to determine what you do going forward.
Thorough assessment of damage to individual trees will help guide your next steps in forest management. Remember, many factors impact your decision to keep or remove trees and/or downed wood. These important decisions should be based on the objectives present in your forest management plan. Don't have a forest management plan? Connect with a professional forester today.